Okay, well, we're going to start today with just a quick recap on what we did yesterday. So I'm sure you all remember everything that was said. First of all, Sarah gave a presentation and we gave you a quick snapshot of the sort of environment of fingerprints at the moment, some of the challenges that are being made, and we looked at fingerprints against the criteria that we'd constructed to see how scientific it is, whether there's any truth or value in some of the criticisms that are being made. And we suggested that there possibly were some areas in fingerprints where we could improve. I then introduced some very basic probability concepts, and then we looked at how those probability concepts could be used to, first of all, explain how we carry out a fingerprint examination now, this idea of subjective probability, and show that that has some validity in science and mathematics. So what we're doing now is not wrong, and it's effective, and it's reliable, so we don't have to be too concerned. But then also showed where there were some of those gaps really did exist, and how we could extend the use of probability into designing software models, and what a software model meant, and software tools that could assist in improving the fingerprint process. Then we demonstrated one of those software products, FSS Fingerprint Actis, to you, let you play with that a little bit to see on just some known impressions how the model performs. And then I sort of rolled that all together, showed you a graph of some of the other experiences and other information we have around the use of that software model, indicated where the software model might be used, and perhaps how we could integrate it into our current process. And then rather tantalizingly left this opportunity for taking software models and then looking at the latent prints that we currently discard, or latent prints that aren't sufficient, those inconclusives, and how we might think about extending the scope of fingerprints. Okay, so that's basically what we did yesterday. Now, before we go on and do what we're doing today, what I'm interested to know is, what are your impressions at this stage? So I'm not going to pick on anyone. Can we have a volunteer? Someone would like to say what they think. What do they think of the show so far, really? Anybody would like to offer some thoughts?
Interesting concept.
Brief and to the point. Yeah, do you want to expand on that a bit? Is there what in particular is interesting?
I mean, as you said, this is first generation software, so I think it needs to be expanded and go further with it and see where it leads.
Okay, that's good. Yeah.
I think as far as the fingerprint world is concerned, it may open up a whole new avenue, and it gives you some highly probable maybe concepts like DNA and footwear and hair and fiber and that sort of stuff has given in the past, where fingerprints it either has been, it is or it isn't. Yeah. And this just, it may not be an individualization, but it adds some weight to a suspect or takes some weight away from a suspect.
And is that a good thing to think about doing that?
I think so.
What's the sort of general view of the class? Do you think that's something we want to do? Is that beneficial? Yeah.
I think it could be another tool in a toolbox, but I don't think it can be a standalone type of idea, because the technology and that is not mature enough to capture what we do, and because it's first generation. But it's never going to be able to render a decision, because it's still, you're never going to eliminate the judgment factor from it, no more than you can from the medical professions or anything like that.
Absolutely, and that, as we said in the presentation, that's exactly the point. This is not a replacement for what we do. This is something that's additional to our current processes. So we're not throwing anything away and replacing it. We're adding this to improve what we do. Particularly as this is, as you say, it's first generation, and it's only modeling part of what we do as a latent print examiner. You can envisage the models if actually developing over the coming years and becoming more and more sophisticated and taking more and more in. So you can envisage a time where a machine can do what we do, but what I would say is that that's a long way in the future. certainly way after I retire. Actually, that's not that long. That's a long way in the future, but that's true. Any other comments?
I think there's a lot of value in the tool for documentation, and I'm excited about the ability to provide more than just an inconclusive result in court. I think there's a lot more you can say about a latent that maybe you're not willing to individualize, but can provide evidence to the court that's valuable. And right now, in the current way that we model our testimony, all we can say is, I can't tell you anything. And this gives us an opportunity to provide more information that can be weighed whichever way it goes, and it's a good tool for that.
Yeah. Do most people, how do people see the tool being used? Do you see it being used every time? Lots of shaking their heads.
See that what I see is that we won't want to use it every time. However, once you open the Pandora's box, the defense is going to expect you to deliver a probability on every rant you present in court.
Okay, and I think that's very true. In other classes we've had, that's come out as a thing, and I share that completely, that there is a concern about control. How do we manage the use of this tool? Because certainly from my perspective, I would not envisage using this tool in my own casework, in my own lab, every time. I would envisage using this when I need to use it. It's a tool. It's just like a mechanic. You use a particular wrench at a particular time. But you're absolutely right, Owen. We may not be in total control of that. So there is a real issue there in terms of how the profession demonstrates, as it were, to our customers, if we put it in that term, where it's best used and where it's most reliable. Because we all know that there's going to be those cases where actually running a likelihood ratio is not really going to help one way or the other. We can be fairly confident of what we're saying without that.
What we see happen is I imagine, without talking to the people in the room, you often go to court to testify why prints weren't developed. Juries are beginning to expect fingerprints and DNA on every case, even cases that DNA wouldn't mean anything on. Well, once we unveil and open this Pandora's box, they're going to start expecting a likelihood ratio on every examination you perform.
Yeah, and that's right. I don't quite like the idea of Pandora's box.
Because they're going to start using it and it's going to keep going.
Yeah.
But I think that's true. But and as we mentioned, I think I mentioned to some of you, I'm not sure it came out in class, what we also need to think about is where we are in the stage of the development of this process. We're right at the beginning of this. None of this software is currently validated to go out there and be used. So we've got maybe 6 months, maybe a year, maybe even longer before we really have to worry about its use. We've got lots of time for us as a profession to discuss. But one of the things there about, well, the defense expects a likelihood ratio over time. One of the things I mentioned yesterday is the idea of having workstations, so that the likelihood ratio is actually computed as you're doing the examination. So it's not an extra task, it's just always happening. So it could just be put into the report and just reported. And there's nothing wrong with reporting it something that's been made if that's required. Yes, the likelihood ratio is so and so. But when I evaluated it, that really didn't pay a big attention. For whatever reason, that wasn't a big part of my evaluation. So it could be something we just need to stick in there, like we put in the fact that we've got X number of years experience and all the other stuff that we put in because they want to see it, but actually probably doesn't have a huge bearing on that particular examination. The other thing is about AFIS systems, and about AFIS systems might start generating those likelihood ratios as well. So it could be, you're right, it could be that every time we write a report, we do have to express the likelihood ratio, but it may be that it's almost like an automatic thing that is just there. And so we're carrying out the examination as is. That might be a scenario. My personal view is that I think as a fingerprint profession, I think we need to step up to the mark here and say, no, look, this is when we use it. This is what we mean by it. This is where it's beneficial. Because I think in the next year, we will construct all the arguments that are necessary to convince lawyers and policemen and everybody else that we can, if you like, we can be trusted as a profession. We know what we're doing, and we can say when we're doing it. And I'm sort of confident we can do that. But you might be right. Pandora's box, it might be. Anybody else got any?
I think one thing you mentioned about reporting it. I don't think at this stage, even if it had already been validated, unless you had you could give us an uncertainty value if we were, I would never use it in a report. I might use it in my notes and then report it's an identification or it's not or highly probable or something of that nature. But as far as putting that number in there, because if you put a number in, then you have to add that uncertainty value with it. So that would, that needs to be considered when the validation is.
Yeah. And again, that comes back to what I just said to a certain extent, is that where are we in the process here? We've designed models, or models are out there. They're going through that validation, which they will pass, as mentioned when I said about validation. It's actually quite a tricky thing to validate something which is completely new. But they will, you can pretty much say they're going to get through that validation. But then there's that really big and more difficult, it sounds terrible to the people who spent years researching this, but the really difficult thing is, how do I then use that? How do I measure the uncertainties? How do I phrase that in a report? When do I phrase that in a report? That is all stuff that needs to be worked through. And probably one of the sort of objectives of these sessions is that the people who are going to do that, I firmly believe, are you guys. It's no one else. It's no one's going to come to you. We shouldn't have a researcher come to you and say, this is how you're going to write your report, Owen. You're going to put this and you're going to do it this way. Well, one thing, Owen wouldn't do it anyway. But secondly, it's, that's not what we want. We don't want to be dictated to. We need to say, right, this is how it's going to look. And then if, remember, I mentioned a bit yesterday, is this thing about how you do it as a nation, as the United States or as the world. Because this Armageddon scenario of one state starts doing it, another state doesn't, and one state gets played off against another. So, yeah, I think where I see us at the moment is sort of summarise. I think most people, the way what you've expressed to me just sort of briefly now, and when we finish today, it will be interesting to see if those views change slightly or harden in a particular way. But where you are now is where most examiners need to be. It's a sort of an informed skepticism. Yeah, I can see what it is, I can see the benefits, but what about this, what about this, what about this? And when these models sort of become available and they're tested a bit more and used a bit more, then we start to say, okay, yeah, that's good, I can understand how this is going to work, and now I can see how I'm going to use this. And that's sort of where these sessions are supposed to put people in that place. I quite often use a religious metaphor for this. I'm not trying to make you fundamentalists in probability. One, because with some of you, and I'm not looking at you deliberately, Owen, but with some of you, we're not going to make that. If you all get out of this room as agnostic, then this has been a success, because this is what it's designed to do. Put people in that place where they've got the right information, they can look at these things, and then when they become available to test, because I am hoping you're all going to want to test this and sort of break it, if you like, that once those tests are done and the information's there and we see and we can value and we can quantify what the benefits are, then we can make the informed decision as to whether or not we do it or we don't do it. So whether it really is a Pandora's box and, we are releasing the ultimate evil and we want to put the lid back on if we can and throw it away.
In Pandora's box, there's some good that comes out too, but the evil also comes.
And I think...
you got to take the whole package. And to clarify, I'm not against this. I believe that it's a very good tool to put in the toolbox. It worries me about the pathway that we're going by through this and what it's going to create, the extra workload it's going to create. Then we're required to do this in every case, because once we do it, they're always going to want it.
And like I say, I'm quite comfortable with that, because I sort of have those same worries myself. I mean, I've only ever said this, Sarah, but there's been times over the last couple of years when I've sort of woken up and thought, what are you doing? Why are you involved in this? Why are you making your life so complicated? So there is that sort of element of that. But I think one thing we'll never perhaps be able to do is, or we should never do anyway as a profession, is just sort of pretend it doesn't exist, which, we know unfortunately there are members and colleagues who are like that, who want to pretend this doesn't exist and roll back the years and, oh, no, I don't. It's there, so we have to deal with it. But I'm also quite comfortable with the idea that it doesn't go very far, that it ends up as one of those little tries, but when we evaluate what it really means to us, it doesn't really make a great deal of difference. And we say, well, we're not going to use this. And that's a real possibility, I think, for first generation, that we say, well, okay, when it can do this, maybe we can see the value, but at the moment it's there.